Hello everybody, this is BKC back in from the depths, and today what I want to talk about is optimizing motors. And what got me to this topic is this motor right here, which is a motor I'm particularly fond of. There's nothing special about it. I think originally what it really is just basically four of my 3Ts tied together. And I think originally it was a 2 inline turbo motor. So the efficiency wasn't that good for how much space it took up. The density isn't that good because it doesn't make that much power because of how much space it takes up. And then the efficiency isn't really that good. Taking up this much space, you would want it to be like ultra efficient, and it really wasn't that good. And then one day out building another motor, I was like, you know what, I could actually squeeze 3 carburetors on here and make it a pretty decent motor. I mean 3 turbos on here on each carb and make it a decent motor. And it brought the efficiency up to where it's worth the space, but it's still, even with the increased efficiency, it's still not the most optimized motor. It's really just, I like it because it's one of the only motors I got you could just walk through the middle of it. And like I said, I just envision it being used in a hull. And I probably would never use it because it's only 1600 power. It takes up a lot of room. But I could imagine like a V-hull battleship where you had an engine room. By the time you had the side of your hull over here, you got just some space armor with a little flotation ballast areas. You would have like an engine room that was, say, 7 wide, and you could throw like a hypercube in there. But let's say you had like all your rooms, and on my ships, I want to be able to walk through them. And if I had a 7 wide engine room with a hypercube in there, you would slap it down in the middle. And say you had a door right here, you would open the door, then you'd walk in, and you'd have to walk around the motor, and then come over here to this next door, and then go through. And I don't really like that. I don't really like that. So then you kind of got to offset the motor to where you got more room to walk. But then it gets, it kind of bothers me obsessively compulsively because you got this like 7x7 room with a 5x5 motor shoved in the corner. Whereas this motor, I would see that you would just sink it down, put your door to where your character could just walk in, and then another door would be right here, and you could just walk through it. So you get, say if you had 2 of them in there, you just have a long tube where you just walk through it, and that's kind of why I like it. Other than that, it's nothing special. It's just 4 of my 3Ts scabbed together, and it's just not optimized. But I wanted to go through how I optimize motors because I get the question a lot. It's like, I want to learn about this. I want to learn, how do you build motors so good? And I mean, the answer to that is just building motors. The way you get good at building motors is you build motors. I mean, nobody's born knowing how to build a house. Nobody's born, you go through basic education, and then you learn, then you take on a trade, and then even if you go to school for, architecture and stuff like that, throw that person out on a construction site, and they're going to be pretty much useless because they're going to have all this knowledge, and they're not really going to know how to do it. Actually building a house is what makes you good at building a house. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you how I optimize motors, and this motor is a good candidate. So we're going to go ahead here and okay, I do have it set up to capture. We're looking good. We're going to capture it. We're going to bring it over to an empty spot on the raft because I have extended it a few more times. I think it's like 20 something blocks more. 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 20 more blocks on both sides bigger now. Okay, and then what we're going to do is we're going to place that prefab down right here. So the motor runs the way the motor runs, and it's optimized the way it's optimized now. And it's like, how can we improve this motor? Well, the reason that it's not really considered that good is because the density is too low. It only makes 1,600 horsepower in a 5x6x7 space, and that's just too much space for 1,600 horsepower, because we have motors like the Evil Brick making 1,200 in a 3x5x5 space. So it's, you know, less power, but it's way less space. And then you got a motor like the Hypercube, which I passed up, that makes 2,400 horsepower in a 5x5x5 space. So that motor has to be ultra efficient, and that's why when it wasn't efficient, I knew there was more in it, and I didn't throw it away. And I got it into the, you know, the maximum for a three turbo per carb engine, and I got it somewhat usable. But density for me, about 8 to 10 density is a good, an average, you know, middle of the road density. So I would like this to be in the 8 range somewhere to be a good motor that I would say, okay, here's a good motor to use, because I like the motor. It's just it's just unique, and that's why I like it, because the hole down the middle. But to get the density up, we need to either increase the power, or we need to get rid of some of the wasted space. And the wasted space in this motor is, I think it's 6 long. So this is 6 blocks of wasted space right down the center. There's 5 blocks down here, and then there's 6 blocks right here between the cylinders. So we go, well, what do we need to do to get rid of that space? Well, since it's three T's, we can't fill this space. We couldn't put like a cylinder here or a carburetor here, because these are individual motors. They're not going to share parts, power making parts. I can't just throw a carburetor in here and bump it up extra 200 horsepower. What's going to happen is one's going to see, you know, the carburetor, and then the other one's not. So I'm just going to lose an exhaust on this one, and I'd gain 100 horsepower on this one. And then to try to fit 3 extra turbos to keep the same efficiency in this weird space it's not really going to be doable. So the best thing to do on this motor is to get rid of the space. And if let me get up my block here. If to get rid of this space, and let's say we just cut it out. So we're just going to cut it out. What would we give up? Well, if we made these cylinders touch, we would lose these 2 exhausts. We would lose these 2 exhausts. We would lose these 2 exhausts and these 2 exhausts. So that's 8 exhausts that we would lose. And that's not that bad, because if I remember right, this motor, let's go run it real quick. I think it's got like 50 something exhaust. I'm not sure. Yeah, 56 exhaust gas. So giving up 8 exhausts really won't hurt this motor that much. It'll just take this maximum power per fuel at 54%, and it'll just raise it. It'll go higher. So it might drop it down to, say, like just 5,000 at 50%, at like a 60% load or something like that. But it's not really going to affect the fuel usage that much. So that's a good thing to do. It's not going to really hurt that much. So the way I do it is I just clear out. I got half the motor there, and then I just clear out anything that is in the way. And basically we're just going to cut the motor in half, remove anything. It doesn't really matter what half of the motor you keep, but we're just going to drop this into back to the depths from where it came. Okay, so now we got half of the motor. No big deal. Then what we go down here, we go back to place prefab again, and we got the same, motor in the same orientation. And what we'll do is we'll just say, okay, well that space is gone, and we'll go ahead and scab the motor back together, and then we're going to have all kinds of weird blocks left over, just because the overhang, the motor hung out. When you scab motors a prefab into a place, if you got a block already there, it just won't place in that block. But if there was any empty space, it'll fill that empty space. So you got to check anywhere that you got like motors and empty space for just extra. You don't want to add to the cost of your motor. So like, if there was anything here, it would have put a pipe there. Okay, we don't need this anymore because it was a four extension pipe plus a. Now notice it joined the exhaust in pretty good. It joined in the exhaust here. Everything joined in pretty good. And then we just check our flow like we normally did. Okay, so right here we had a 4 meter exhaust pipe. Fuel engines, exhaust, and a single exhaust pipe, but we don't need that anymore. So we got that. Everything's good. Our exhaust comes in here. Our serial chain is intact. It didn't change anything in our serial chain, but our parallel exhaust collection is a little bit off. And originally, it would collect the exhaust here, go around this ring, come all the way around to this side, and then how did the top side? I forgot already. The top side. Oh yeah, the top came in through this waffle pattern right here. It collect all these exhaust here. And that's kind of why I kind of left this like these little arcs like this, because it just looked cool, because it didn't really matter because it all came down this center line and came here to the front ring and the back ring and joined all together. So that's a little bit of wasted space, but we've gotten rid of that area between. So these exhausts are now trapped. So we have to do something about that. We still need this for our series side, but our parallel side. So what we would do is, just come in here, remove this, go snatch our, that's a 4-way. Well, we need a 4-way. Put our 4-way there. We could use 4-way. It don't hurt anything. We need a through pipe. Through pipes there. I need to snatch up a corner pipe. Okay, so now that takes the top, adds it into the collector ring. No problem. But this side right here, now this ring, which would go through the waffle pattern in the middle, is also missing. So we got to do the same thing here. Go back and snag a 4-way. Go back and snag the through pipe. Oops, not there. Go back and snag a corner pipe. Put that on. Okay, so now we've got this side connected back in. It can get all the way around back to here. Now let's check the bottom side. Now the bottom side's the same way. It's trapped in. It can't come this way, but it can go this way. So again, it's the same thing, the same exact procedure. Grab our 4-ways, pop those in. And a lot of times when I'm doing this, a lot of times I'll just do stuff for looks reason, because a cross pipe doesn't cost any more than a 4-way pipe, so I do stuff like that just for looks. I do that all the time. I'm adding stuff in just for looks. And then put our through pipes, go up and snag a elbow, and there we go. Now we've got all the exhaust could come from the bottom, go this way, go around this way, go to the front ring where it picks up the sides and goes into our serial side. So that would be the way, and we'd run it and see if it was worth it. But now the binding box is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So it's a 6 by 6 by 5 instead of a 5 by 6 by 7. And so that would affect the density a little bit. And at this point we could look at it, run it, see if it was worth it, because the density is smaller now. Now it doesn't have a center line, so you would have to use a left engine and a right engine, you know, with a walkway in between them. So we lost the walkway through the motor, but on a wider ship, you know, we could have the space in between them and you know, have two, a left and a right, because it just doesn't have a center anymore. But if we look at the motor now, we go, well, we gave up the two exhausts here, you know, the two exhausts there, two exhausts here. Now this carburetor is touching this exhaust to make 100 horsepower. This carburetor is touching this side to make 100 horsepower. So if you look at it and you look at it from the top, we're four 3T motors that were all spaced out from each other, and then now they're just touching each other. And you go in and you go, well, if we got rid of this whole row right here, this carburetor would be connected onto this exhaust that we lost, okay? And before, it was collecting 4 exhausts, and then by putting it together like this, we lost an exhaust. If we take another row out, we would put this carb in the exhaust that we lost, which would make 3 more exhausts. So instead of the cylinder putting out 4 exhausts, it would now put out 6 exhausts, because it was making 3 exhausts per carburetor. And so to test it, we would do the same thing. We'd come back in here, we'd go back into the prefabs, and we'd just do the same thing. We put another motor down, you know, run it, test it. Let's get rid of this motor first. I'll just get rid of this because no matter how big I build my engine test platform, I just keep adding more motors, and then like motors sit here for weeks and months, and I know there's more in them, or I know they need a little bit of tinkering or a little optimization, or they're good enough but I know I can make them better, and I get ideas for other motors and I just don't touch them, and then I'll be building another motor and then I'll learn a little trick or something and I'll go, oh, that would work good on this motor. Then I come back and test them, and then I end up with 27 different motors to find out which one's better. Okay, so we go back into our prefabs, place prefab, and we just do the same thing. Put the motor down. Okay, so now we want to get rid of blocks. We want to just get rid of that center, get rid of this again. Now this is going to be a little bit more complicated because I think it's going to mess up a little bit more than what it mess up a little bit more than the last one did, but it should be the same process. You just get rid of half of the motor. I'm really screwing up on deleting stuff. What is holding? Okay, there we go. And then we go back into our place prefabs. But this time, we're going to line, instead of just lining them up like this, we're going to overlap the cylinders. And we're going to have more overhang, so it's going to be more to clean up, but it shouldn't be too bad. Yeah, you can see you got this just oddball hanging, and then it's not going to drop off because it's scabbed into the motor. So we got this extra little block. I don't think any of this is going to fall off. I got to delete every single bit of it. But this, by doing this, we've gone even smaller, so we should have increased density more. It's just going to be whether or not the power numbers is better. Is it worth doing? And the only real way to answer, like, I can't look at a motor. I can look at a motor. If somebody's got this motor and they say, oh, this motor's pretty good, but, you know, its efficiency's, I'm going through too much fuel, or this motor's taking, I don't have enough room for the power that I've got and I need, or something like that. I can look at motors and tell what the problem is and how to fix them. But I can't just look at a motor and go, oh, this motor is going to do this or that. I mean, I can look at a motor and go, oh, well, it's got 4 turbos per carb. It should hit 50, 66 on the efficiency. I can look at a motor and go, okay, well, this has got 2 carbs, so it's going to get 6 exhaust out here, 6 exhaust out here, 6 exhaust here, 6 exhaust here. You know, write that down and go, okay, well, this one shares, so that's 6 exhausts, so it's 8 cylinders times 6 exhausts. That's how many exhausts it should be, and then say, well, that's over the max 30. But I can't just go, oh, well, this is the motor you need. You know, I'm not that good. But playing around with the motors, building them, actually building motors like this, and then testing them is the way you find out if, okay, so that's totally messed up. This is totally messed up. This is now a 3-pipe. So let's put us a 3-pipe in there. We're going to need a corner pipe. Here. We're going to need a through pipe here. We're going to need a through pipe there. We're going to need a corner pipe here. Same thing over here. We're going to need an X junction here. Need to steal a through pipe. Throw a through pipe there. Throw a through pipe there. Throw a through pipe there. A through pipe there. Corner pipe here. Corner pipe here. Delete this random floating exhaust here and here. Another random floating exhaust here. Random exhaust floating there. And it looks okay. So our exhaust comes in on this side, collects here, comes on this side, collects all this on here, comes around here, goes around. That's all good. Our serial side comes in here, goes down here, goes across the bottom, goes to the other side, comes back up, goes off. So that's all still good. So we've got the motor, you know, pretty well done. And what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and build these 3 motors out, run them, test them, do all that, so we can compare whether or not this is, you know, to see what the differences is. And the way you do for cost analysis, you could sit there and count every single part. It gets pretty complicated if you're going to do a massive amount of parts. It gets pretty complicated, and counting it out is not really the way to do it. The way I do it is you go into your prefab, and you see your prefab right here. Let me write this down because I don't have enough room on my signs. But you see the number in the corner of 48. That's the full number. So it's using 563 material for the full motor. And then you just wipe the prefab. Oops, I gotta go to capture prefab. Wipe the slot, and then just grab the new motor. You know, grab the modified version, and then you could exit out. Now this motor, after 2 modifications to it, it is now 403.75. So that is a difference just in cost. So let's say the motors run exactly the same. They run 100% exactly the same. You know that it's going to be better for the smaller motor because it takes less space. It makes the same power, and 563 minus 403.75 equals 159 material, 159 and a quarter material less. Cost, it's more cost effective just to cut this motor down the way we does. So I'm gonna go up and I'm gonna build all three motors out. I'm gonna test them, flag them, do all the stuff, and I'll see you guys in a second. Okay, welcome back. This is all three motors. I lined them all up, set them all up with ACBs because they're multi-core motors, and it isn't really a problem in this motor. You can get inside and actually test all of them and see all the stats. But once you get to this one, you kind of got to go inside, and it's kind of hard to grab the engine block. I still got to do it to see the differences in how they run. But well, let's look at the stats and see what it's done. Okay, so first off, we went from a 5x6x7, which has a center, but it weighs space with a density of 7.62. And like I said, 8 to 10 is about what I try to hit in my motors. So we're a little bit below average for a 12-cylinder making 1,200 horsepower. Now, 12 cylinders making 1,600 horsepower puts us at 1.33 power per cylinder, and that's 210 binding box. With the cutout space motor, which is still using 4 3Ts, but just cut out the empty space, we went up to 8.89 density. So we've gotten well within. Matter of fact, we hit right in the middle of the average density for my motors at almost 9. But we're still a 12-cylinder making 1,600 horsepower. But the binding box has gone from a 210 down to 180. And we're still making 1.33 power per cylinder. In the second revision cut down motor, density has rised above average. It has gone down to a 5, and also this motor doesn't have a center anymore, so this would be better for, these would be motors in line on a thin hull. This motor would be better for a left and right on a little bit wider hull, and this motor could be either because it has a center. Now we've gone down to a 5x5x6, and we got our density up to 10.67, which is above average. By cutting those cylinders out, we were able to save material cost a significant amount. I think it was like what I said, almost 160 material cost. By getting rid of cylinders and letting one cylinder do the job of 2 cylinders. So it's cut us down to an 8-cylinder 1,600 horsepower, which has pushed us to 200 power per cylinder, and our binding box has dropped from 180, I think it's 30, yeah, 110, yeah, 30. We dropped 30, and then we've dropped another 30 in our binding box. So is it worth it? Do they run any different? I mean, density-wise, we've increased it density. So he's like, well, there's got to be some negative downside. Yeah, yes and no. Off the bat, the original motor makes 579 power per fuel at 0.4 fuel usage, and that's just 0.1 fuel usage per 3T core. So the power per fuel numbers report at 579 for each one. So it's kind of like averaged out. So 579 times 4 divided by 4 is 579. So it works out, and then the fuel is just added together. So 0.1 for each one, and it makes 0.4. In the mid-range, since we're collecting 56 exhaust, that's going to push the mid-range to be more efficient than what it normally would, or higher than what maximum efficiency is for a 3-turbo motor, which is 5066 is what we see at the top end, and that's just set by, you can't go any higher than that with 3 turbos per carb. We can go higher with it in the mid-range, but we're not gaining power per fuel. It's just the way that the fuel usage curve works. You know, we start off drawing no fuel. It gets to about halfway at the halfway point, then it starts rising. It's an exponential curve that really only takes effect at the end. And so at the end, maximum efficiency, we're over 30 exhaust, so we hit maximum efficiency. At the point of 30 exhaust, and fuel usage continues to rise, but efficiency can't rise anymore because it's already topped out. So in the mid-range at 54%, we hit 59.84, which is almost close to a maximum efficient, well, I guess be maximum efficiency for 3 turbos and a supercharger. And it actually pushes it into the zero fuel usage category. And at 50% it shows up too. So there's somewhere in here, there's a 0% fuel usage band where 0.1 per each cylinder is getting knocked out. And you know, that's where if you was going to use a motor with wasting this much space, you would probably want to use it as a zero fuel motor and try to keep it in that range. And then you would still have a pretty efficient motor, you know, under combat load where you're running all your ammo processors, maybe a few shields or rails or something like that. You would still have, you know, a pretty efficient motor when it's maxed out. And you really wouldn't want to run it at low RPMs because it uses the same amount of fuel to make 160 power as it does to make 1600 power. What's more efficient? Well, obviously, using the same fuel to make 1600 power is more efficient. So in a boat like this, if you was using this at a kinetic drive where your boat was using you know, 200 power all the time, but under combat load it used all 1600 power, at that point you're almost better off not even letting this motor rest, not even letting this motor come down to idle, because you're going to be using the same amount of fuel. You just save the space and all the complexity of all the ACBs turning your shields and your ammo processors and all that stuff off. Just let them run 24/7 because you're going to be using the same amount of fuel. If you had a kinetic drive where you was spinning at the 800 to 900 RPM range where it's using zero fuel, then that would be ideal to keep it there, to turn it off, all that stuff off during combat and keep it in that 900 range, and 1000 you know, 1600 under combat load. So that would be the use cases. But as a generator, none of these numbers make any difference, because as a generator we'd be running off of electric until the batteries got low, and then the 5066 would be our number. We'd run at that number until our batteries were charged, and then we would shut off. So if it was using it as a generator, it doesn't, all the rest of these numbers doesn't make a difference. If we're using it as a kinetic drive and we've got a normal load of around 6 to 900, then we would want to turn everything off and try to keep in that 6 to 900 what would it be, about yeah, about 8, probably about 700. It might, let's say a 700 to 900 range, it uses zero fuel. You'd want to stay in that range at all times, and then under combat we would still have a pretty efficient motor. So that's what we'd want to do with this motor. And then if we had a ship that used almost no power at cruise, and then, you know, use 1600 under combat load, you're almost better just leaving all your shields and stuff and saving the space and complexity of the ACBs and just let your shields run, because there's no difference in fuel usage. In In the cut down motor, again, we've got the same number of cylinders, the same number of power. Our low end range has gone from 579 power per fuel, 0.4 fuel usage, to 505, but still 0.4 fuel usage. So the numbers don't mean anything. The use case is almost going to be exactly the same because we're using 0.4 fuel. In the mid-range, we've gone from 5149 down to 3666. Now that's a pretty decent drop in efficiency. Is it the end of the world? Not really, because we still use 0.4, and probably what that is at this efficiency, it's enough to knock the 0.1 fuel usage down below, like it's probably something like 0.5 or 0.6 fuel usage per engine in this motor. So it reports as 0.1, and then in this motor it's like 0.45, so it rounds down to 0 per motor. So that's not really that big of a deal. We're still talking small. We're still talking sipping of fuel. And the other thing is that we've saved 30 blocks of space. So putting a little 4-beam fuel tank in extra, over what you normally would use for fuel, it's not that big of a deal. And then, of course, the 5066 for max efficiency, because if we run this motor, we went from 56 exhaust down to 48. Okay, so that's not that great. We've lost some exhaust, not that big, and that's why we've lost that efficiency in the mid-range, because that's the only place they can really take effect. Over 30 doesn't do anything on the top end. Where over 30, it doesn't do anything on the top end. It only really affects the mid-range. So this one is just not pushing that rounding error to report 0. What has it done to the use case other than saving 30 blocks of space and taking the center out the motor? It doesn't really change all that much. The only difference really is that, say, 700 to 900 range, where it uses 0 fuel, that target would be lost, because now the motor, no matter where you run it, it uses the same fuel. So you're always going to want to be getting 1600 horsepower out of it. That's the only thing that's really changed. The use case for this motor, whether you had a low normal power ship or a medium power ship and you was using it as a kinetic drive, it wouldn't matter, because no matter what ship you put this in, it's going to draw the same amount of fuel no matter where you run this motor. So the ideal use case for this, which would be the same for this, would be as a generator motor. Off, using 0 fuel till the batteries get low. It runs at 100% and turns off when the batteries are charged. So in that use case, 5066.4 fuel, 5066.4 fuel, we've just gained 30 blocks of space. In the mid-range, if you was going to use it as a kinetic drive in trying to keep it at optimal efficiency, this one would be kept at, you'd want to keep this one at 864 power for 5984 power per fuel, where it uses 0, which is 54% of its load. And this motor, you'd want to keep it at 63%. And if you notice, this motor actually still does, it loses about 200 power per fuel, but it still does have a 0 fuel range. That 0 fuel range has probably tightened up a bit and has moved up higher in the power band. So this motor you'd want to keep at 1,008 horsepower, where this one wants to be at 864 to use zero fuel. So it still has a zero fuel usage range, but it is just higher now, and it's probably narrower too. Tracking that down takes a lot of work. You got to go into ACB, move it at 1%, and then test and see where it starts using fuel, and then write down the percentage, and then go up by 1% till it actually starts using using fuel again, and then testing to see. It takes a long time to test that, so I didn't really test that, but from testing past motors, it's probably narrowed that range up because it's going to hit max efficiency at 63%, and then it's going to start falling off again. And it just shows that the curve has moved up a little bit. Now, compared to the last motor, again, we've gained another 30 space, but we've dropped the cylinder count down to make the same power. We've cut down 2 fuel engine generators, which cost 50 material apiece, so that's 100 savings right there. We've dropped 4 cylinders? Yeah, 4 cylinders. That's another 20 material. We've dropped 2 cranks for another 10 material. We dropped a lot of exhaust pipes because we're plumbing this up twice. And it ends up being about almost 160 material cost to make the same power. Now, what has it done? Well, we've dropped another 30 blocks. We're making the same power, and we've gone from 579 to 505. This one's at 504. No difference. Absolutely, that's within margin of error. I would almost say it is margin of error because they should technically run exactly the same. It might be a little bit of a heat. It might be heat playing in a little bit because this has 2 cylinders making 100 horsepower, drinking a low amount of fuel. This cylinder's drawing twice as much fuel, but it's receiving twice as much benefits of fuel efficiency. So it's probably just a heat making that 1 point in power per fuel difference, but it runs identically, and it saves 60 blocks over this motor. In the mid-range, 5149, 3666, 3666. Now, this is what's interesting. This motor went from 0 fuel. This motor went to 0.4 fuel. This motor's down to 0.2 fuel. Now, the reason for that, it's what it is it's a this one is getting fuel use per motor down enough to round down to 0. This motor is just missing that point to where each motor is rounding down to 0. This engine is actually less motors because we've dropped 2 fuel engine generators. So this is actually 4 motors. This is actually 4 motors. This is actually only 2 motors. This is 4 3Ts put together. This is still technically 4 3Ts put together. This is no longer a 3T. This is a radial with packed into another radial. And what it's doing is it's just taking those very low numbers per cylinder and projecting it onto that motor. So this one may be 0.1 at each motor. What we've done is we've taken the rounding error and we've cut it in half because we're doubling it by putting all the cylinders onto one engine, but then we're cutting that rounding error chance in half because we have here we're taking 4 that are low enough to round down. Here we're taking 4 that's not quite low enough, so it just reports as 0.4. Here we're doubling the fuel usage per motor, but then we're cutting it, in we don't have as many chances to cut it in half. So what it's doing is it's still running at 0.1. It's not enough to cut it down, same as this motor, but we've only got 2 motors, so it reports as 0.2, whereas this one not being able to round down is showing up as 0.4 because we've got 4 motors. So it's just a little trick with the rounding down. It's not rounding down, but we've got less motors, so it's showing up as 0.2. So it's kind of like right in the the mid-range, where it's just a little thing that happens. And but it's still 3666, 3666. This is 0.4 fuel, this is 0.2 fuel. So technically we've increased its cost efficiency because it's 160 material less than this motor. I didn't check it against this motor. This one doesn't save all that much. This one really just saves the exhaust pipes down the center. Other than that, it doesn't. And then you're actually taking some of the pipes you saved down the center and using to replumb, because you still got to keep your parallel side all connected. So you're just shifting where you put the pipes. So we're saving space but not that much cost. Here we're saving even more space and cost. And we've actually got cost efficient, more space efficient, and we're actually more fuel efficient because we're taking better advantage. Even though we don't get the power per fuel down as low, we're cutting the our rounding errors. We don't have 4 rounding errors. We only got 2, or not rounding errors, but missed chances at rounding errors. This one is missing the rounding area 4 times. This one is missing 2 times. So it's technically more efficient. And then on the top end, 5066, 0.4 fuel, exactly the same. And then this one maxes out at 59.79. At 63% 0 fuel. This one is 59.79, that's odd, at 0.2 fuel. So this one has pushed into the point where it can actually round down to 0 in all 4. This one never reaches that point where it could round down. So if I didn't test it to see if this ever goes into it. I would assume it doesn't go into the 0 fuel range, but I would have to test the two to see if how narrow that band is versus this, and then you'd have to do like a dyno test, which I'm still trying to work on a way to do it. The only way to do it is to make a separate dyno raft and then copy the prefab, put it on the dyno raft. Because if I make the dyno, it's going to be running all the engines at the same time, and there's no way to, there's no way to put control of one motor on a specific amount of fuel going in and out of different loads over time. So it would take a lot of testing to figure, to test to see if that's even worth even worrying about that 0 fuel range. I would assume it's probably not. Even in this motor, I would say that 0 fuel range is just an anomaly. And I'll show you why that it's not really even a 0 fuel motor. Not that. If we run this motor at 54%, we're technically rounding down to 0. So it shouldn't use any fuel whatsoever. Now lately, in the last patch, I did notice there's a bug. I don't know if this is a bug or a change to the designer. Before, your craft would use fuel. And then when your fuel was out, you would have to either replace the fuel tanks, which costs a lot of resources, but since you have unlimited resources, who cares in the designer? But it's annoying constantly replacing your fuel tanks, and the option would be to spawn in a base or refinery to supply your ships, to where you could do your testing, turn the resources off, do all your testing in your battles, and then go back to your refinery. But the way that the designer the longer you're in it, the more it lags out. You have to restart, loading in a new base, loading in what you're testing on, resetting up the supply chain, and all that. It gets kind of annoying. I just go ahead and replace my tanks. I just go on my deck and put 30 or 40 huge tanks, and then just cut them off, and then it takes the average of how much he was missing and averages out between all the tanks. But now it's showing motors that use like less than 0.1 fuel are showing up but not using fuel. So I can't really tell if this is using fuel or not. It's not showing up. It's not showing that it's drawing fuel from a tank. But I can show you one thing. If you go to V, if you press V to bring up your vehicle stats, and you press the power tab, this is every motor on this Raft. Now, if a motor is using 10 different small motors tied together, it'll show up 10 different times. It doesn't differentiate, but I've got a button on this Raft that I go hit, and it kills all my motors to make sure none of them's running that way. And here you can see the 4 motors that are running. They're running at 216 power, and it's actually showing 0 fuel per second. And then here you have an approximation, a summary of all your power on the craft. Your fuel burning is costing you 0.1 fuel a second, which is approximately 0.01 material per second. So it's using a 1-to-1 conversion, which is about 1 material per minute. Okay, so from the game's perspective, whether we're rounding down or not, it's still subtracting 1 material per minute. Now, in a campaign, I don't know if this adjusts itself for the refinery, your refinery. I don't know how it could, because it's a vehicle stat. So you do have to take this with a grain of salt. But for quick calculations, all these motors are on all this Raft, and whether it takes the refinery into consideration or not is irrelevant, because it's showing this motor is burning 1 material a minute. So if I test it against another motor, it should change. So let's run it at 100% where it actually does use fuel, and go back into V. See, now it's showing that we're using actually 0.3 fuel per minute. 0.3 fuel, which is 0.3 material per second, or 2 per minute. So it does show up that sometimes looking at, when you get into really, really low fuel usage, you have to ask yourself, is it a rounding error? Is it actually coming out of my tank? See, it's still not, nope, it's actually using fuel from my tank now. I don't know if that's a bug or a change or not, but I used to can build engines that use 0.1, and it would draw fuel like every 10 seconds it would draw 1 fuel, but lately it hasn't been doing that, and it's getting hard to test 0 fuel motors, and I'm right at the point where I need to test a lot of 0 fuel motors. But this is showing 0.4 fuel usage, but it's actually drawing 0.3 from a fuel tank. And if you look, about every 3 seconds it's drawing 1 from a fuel tank. So when you get down to those super low fuel numbers, it doesn't really mean anything. You're really just splitting hairs at that point. You're already past the point of diminishing returns if you can get down to to 0.1 fuel for whatever power you're making. But probably what's happening here is you have a rounding error in the engine, and it's showing up, it's just rounding up to 0.1, but it's probably taking this as 4 engines, adding them together, and then doing a rounding error again. So what's probably happening is each motor is probably drawn like 0.89. Well, 0.89 rounds up to 0.1, and then say it's 0.78 times 4, would be 3.12. So that would, each motor would individually show 0.1, but then as a vehicle is taking those 0.1s and is probably taking the actual numbers, adding them together and saying, oh, you got a 0.3 fuel usage, 0.312 fuel usage. Well, we're just going to round that down to 0.3. So sometimes these numbers you got to take with a grain of salt. And if you have more motors, you've got more chances of that happening. So it's happening in this motor. Let's go to this motor and run it at, what was this one, 63%? 63 test. And we'll go to the vehicle stats. See, 0.2 material. Now, the other one was 0.1 material, but it was still 1 per minute. So even though I'm using twice the fuel, you know, it's technically drawing the same amount of fuel from my fuel tank, or an equivalent of the same amount of fuel. So technically, it should be, you know, almost a third less efficient. Is it third? Or, yeah, a third less efficient or something like that. 50% less efficient, depending on whether you go by fuel cost or power per fuel numbers. But it's still 1 material a minute. It's exactly the same. So, you know, you got, again, take that with a grain of salt. We go to 100%. Well, of course, it should run exactly the same. And 0.03, exactly the same as the other motor. So there's nothing really lost here. Oh, I didn't look at the tank. Let's see if it is actually drawing like point. No, it's still showing as a 0 fuel motor, even though it's reporting as 0.2. It's still not using fuel. And then we go to 100%. It's going to be every 3 seconds. Yep, every 3 seconds. So even though it's 0.4, it should be like every 4 seconds, 3.5 seconds, or something like that. It's effectively the exact same thing. There's no difference between the two motors, really. They actually draw exactly the same. And then in this motor, we should never hit that 0 point, that 0 fuel point. So at 63%, we should always be drawing fuel. And we're not drawing fuel. There's no fuel draw. It should be once every 10 seconds. But we're not drawing fuel. My fuel numbers are not going down. So if we look at the stats, 0.2 material, exactly what is showing as when it does run, but it's still 1 material a minute. I don't know if they need to, it's just the resolution is bad on that stat, because it goes by a minute 60 seconds. It's not going to go, they don't have decimal points in there. It's not like 1 point, you know, 275 per minute, you know. It's not, or it's not divided up by like, you know, 27.375 seconds, you know. There's no resolution here. And that's where the rounding error comes in, that the game is just going, hey, look, every minute I'm taking 1 resource away from you. That's all it's doing. So, you know, is this thing run? Oh, I guess the sound muting kicked in. Yeah, it's running. Where this was where all the other motors are running at 0 fuel range, this one says it's lost it, but it's not drawing fuel. The game doesn't care. The game's like, hey, yeah, you technically built a motor close enough to a 0 fuel motor. We're rounding it down to a 0 fuel motor. And then if we go up to 100%, it should draw the same exact 0.3 fuel. I mean, 1 fuel every 3 seconds. 1 fuel every 3 seconds. Exactly the same. We go in. Fuel burning cost is 0.3, which is approximately 2 per minute. Exactly the same as the other motors. So, I hope that shows you guys that. I know personally, I like efficient motors, but I'm just obsessive compulsive with it to the point where I'm just trying to build really efficient motors in the smallest space possible and all that stuff. But there is a point, and I do recognize it, and I hope it shows you guys that there is a point of diminishing returns. The game, when you get to 3 turbochargers per carburetor, the game does not care anymore. The game is just like, look, I'm not calculating all them numbers out, and it just starts kind of going to like a lookup table where you got the rounding error of the motor reporting to another system, and then that system's adding those together and then rounding that off. And by the time you go through all these rounding errors, all the numbers being processed by this game, the game's just like, you know what? I just don't care anymore, and it just doesn't do any good. So anything past 3 turbos per carburetor, all you're doing is you're just wasting space to post big numbers. That's all you're doing. You're adding cost to your motors. You're using up more space, and if you're doing it in the same space, you're giving up power. But the game doesn't really care, and I hope that shows you guys what I've kind of been saying all along, that anything above, like when you start getting into like the 6,000 and 10,000 power per fuel range, you're not doing it for fuel efficiency. You're not doing it. All you're doing is you're just building motors to go, look what I did. Look how much internet points I got. I hope that shows you guys why ultra efficient motors are just stupid, and I'll see you guys in the next one.